Hey guys, what's up? Wow, decent lighting for once. Amazing, isn't it? You can thank my girlfriend for that one. She came up with the brilliant idea of why don't you just move the lamp closer? Shut up. Anyway, this particular video is not exactly the one that I was planning on doing. The ones that I plan on doing, I still need to actually finish setting up. I need a little bit of help to get it done because it's sort of a demonstration sort of thing. But there was a particular question that I had received under my LK5 videos that I think points to something about jian in general that I really think needs a little bit of updating. It's based on something that I had mentioned about jian before. Sorry about the noise. And I figure we need to kind of touch on it again. But before I get into that, I find it kind of funny that I've sort of become now a spokesperson for LK Chen and the swords that they put out. It's not like they're paying me for this, you know. Like I don't work for the company. I'm not like their spokesperson. I'm not their customer service. But so many people keep hitting me with so many questions, whether it's in the comment section or private message, email, what have you. You know, I keep getting messages about like, do the swords do this, or what happens to be this measurement, or what about this stat? And I'm kind of confused by this. Can you? And it's like, why don't you ask them? Like, all I'm going to do if I don't know the answers, I'm going to go and ask them, some sort of a middleman. But I get it. I get it. I'm not angry at you guys because, I mean, I get it. Like, no one else has really reviewed their swords, as far as I know. At least in, you know, the English-speaking world. So, yeah, I can understand why so many people, you know, have been asking me questions about it. But just keep in mind that I'm pretty much just another customer. I got lucky to have been able to handle these swords. It was only because someone who was a fan is in contact with them, and I was, you know, through them I was able to, you know, get my hands on it. But yeah, before that I had no clue who they were, and even now I'm kind of like you guys. I can't wait to see the next things that they make. But I'm getting off topic, and I want to get to the main topic. Someone had noticed about the LK5 that the balance points seem a little bit different than what other people expect from a jian and from what I had stated. Basically, the question was talking about how I once mentioned that an ideal balance point for a jian should be about 4 to 5 inches from the handguard. That tends to be the sweet spot. However, when you look at the stats for an LK sword, you know, particularly, you know, the reproduction hanjian that I've reviewed before, you usually see it moved up to about like 6 to 8 inches from the handguard. And considering what I've stated before, wouldn't that make them clumsy? You know, the person seemed to have been confused about the fact that I kept talking about how well they felt, how good they felt in the hand, how lively they are, and that, you know, that the movement is just right. But yet, we're talking about at least a good 2-inch difference, if not more. Shouldn't it feel clumsier? That's a good question. And it makes me feel that I'm going to have to kind of update my stance a little bit when it comes to where the balance point is. We have to keep in mind that when I mentioned those balance points before, it was mentioned before I held these swords recently, these swords that I've been holding recently. Generally speaking, when it comes to finding a sweet spot, there's something that you have to consider, and that's the weight of the sword and the length of the sword. That changes things quite a bit as we start talking about balance points and points of percussion and how the sword feels and so on and so forth. Before I got my hands in these hanjian reproductions, I was used to jian pretty much being over 2 pounds. You really couldn't find one that weighed less than that unless you were either willing to spend a whole lot of money, and even then it was rare, or you're willing to get something that wasn't exactly worth the money, if you know what I mean. generally speaking, swords that were lighter than 2 pounds, in the, basic market, like people who generally use their swords for training and they want something real. If you were working with something that was less than good quality, it was going to be with those contemporary wushu, floppy steel swords, chrome steel swords, sometimes even stainless steel swords. They're not, they're definitely not what somebody would call battle ready. They're not real swords. They're practice weapons at best and props at worst, for, doing performances and so on and so forth. If you did want to get a sword that actually was made properly with a good edge, good steel, even if it's around the $200, $300, $400 range, those swords tended to be somewhat heavier. I'm not going to say straight up heavy. 2 pounds is not really all that heavy. But they're definitely not what I would consider light. They're not exactly going to be featherweight. And even though someone like me considers a well-balanced type of sword in that range, it's pretty light, it's pretty maneuverable, it's pretty agile. A lot of people consider that the same thing. When you compare it to the LK10 swords, they're much heavier. Now, when you consider that those swords weigh as much as they do, usually about 2.5 pounds, 2 pounds 4 ounces, 2 pounds 6 ounces, around that range, it makes a lot of sense to have the balance point where it is. Because you have to remember that jian are cut and thrust swords. I've stated this over and over again, and I'm going to keep saying it until I'm blue in the face, because there's a lot of evidence showing that these are cut and thrust, not just purely thrust. So you need to find a balance between having enough mass in the blade and in the swing so that the cut is authoritative, you actually are effective with the cut, but you also have to have that balance point far back enough to have good point control. That's why with those earlier swords, with the weight that they had and also the length that they tend to be, usually the one-handers tend to be around 28 to 32 inches. And usually the sweet spot's around, I personally like it when they're around 30 inches long. I used to like them when they were around 32, and I still kind of do, but 30 is not bad. 28 is the one that you tend to see a lot, especially with certain antiques from the Ming and Qing dynasty era. And even a lot of those antiques tend to be around, unless they happen to be really like light practice swords or whatever, they tend to be around 2 pounds or more. Especially if they're above 28 inches. That's what you're going to see. That's what you're going to get. But now, let's stretch it out. Let's make it longer. And let's make it lighter. Now what? Because remember, if you're lightening the weight, if you're making it weigh less, that's less mass. But you still want to have a cut and thrust sword. That cut still needs enough mass to be able to go through the target. And yet, you still want enough control for that point control. You still want to be able to get the point where you want. But in order for that to have that mass in there, you're going to have to move that point forward a bit, aren't you? And that's why they're balanced the way they are, and yet still feel lively enough. Let's do a little bit of analysis here. Let's look at this close hand. So we're going to be looking at two of these. This one right here is our good old friend, Flying Phoenix. And this one here happens to be the affordable cutting jian from Sinosword. And by the way, I still think Sinosword's a pretty good company, at least if you want to get your hands on, swords based on Ming and Qing designs. Though keep in mind they're going to be a little bit on the heavier side. The lighter side tends to be, the LK10 stuff, which I still consider to be some top-notch stuff. But now let's look at this blade here. Look at this blade, and it looks fairly beefy. I mean, look how wide the blade is. It's at least from, if we're taking my thumb, it's about 2 thumbs wide at the base, about 1 thumb over here, 30 inches from the handguard. We'll talk about that later. Not later. And it's, it's pretty agile. I can get the point pretty much where I want. I can get it at that measuring tape there. I can get it at the magic cards I got stacked over there, that hat over there, which you can't see any of this stuff, so it means nothing to you. But yeah, I can do like the microphone there. I can get this where I want it to go. And yet, there's still enough mass in there for a good cut. But where's the balance point at? Well, let's find out. So, we're going to get our good tape measure here, get that prepared. And we're going to balance that on the scabbard here. Okay, so with that, this looks nice. And yeah, right about there. I said it's good enough. It's right about here. I'm going to keep my eye on that spot. Yep. I'm going to take my trusty little measuring tape here, and I'm going to measure that right about there. So really, this is 5 inches. This is about 5 inches, maybe, give or take a half an inch, but 5 inches. This is about 5 inches from the handguard, from here up to the tip. So, decent enough balance point, still lively enough. I can feel a bit of the weight here because this sword weighs about, I think about 2 pounds, 4 ounces, something like that. I might be off a little bit. I'll have the actual measurement on the screen, but that's what we're looking at here. And I can get it where I want. Now keep in mind, beefier blade, 30 inches, that's good. And notice I'm able to get it where I want it to go. It's pretty agile, right? Now, let's take a look at this one. Flying Phoenix, one of my favorites. And right away we notice a major difference. Now we got a much narrower blade. Now the blade is almost 1 thumb in thickness at the base. And then we look at the tip, it's even smaller, right? It's much longer. This is a 34-inch blade as far as the length of the sword. Still authoritative in that cut, though. Still feels pretty lively, and I can pretty much get it where I want it to go. There's the microphone. It's that light. Magic deck. Another magic deck. Can't see those. Never mind. I can get it where I want it to go. See, there. Boom. I can get it where I want it. But if you've seen the cutting video that I did with Scholar Grim, you know the sword can cut. So it's agile. And it's, definitely maneuverable. Definitely has a good authority with the cut. But that balance point, again, is going to be at a different spot. So let's find it. This one's a little bit trickier. Right about, let's say, right about, it's kind of hard when you have 2 smooth surfaces rubbing against each other. It's hard to get it in one side. There we go. I see it. It's right about there. And we're looking at 6.5. About 6.5 to 7 on this particular blade. Your mileage may vary, but that's where I'm seeing it on this. But yet, despite the fact that it's forward, it definitely doesn't feel like a crowbar. It's still pretty maneuverable. It's still pretty light. And that's the key. The fact that it's a lighter sword, and yet you still want it to have the features of the heavier one that I have there, you're going to have to move it forward. It has to do with just, again, finding that sweet spot. Making swords is all about balance anyway, and I find it interesting that even swordsmanship itself is all about trying to find that balance. When you're making a blade, you got to try to find the sweet spot between having resilient steel versus really hard steel, because you want it to have an edge, but you want it to be able to absorb, the force and the shock of the cut. You want, the sword to not be too heavy so that it's light and maneuverable enough, but have enough mass so that it does enough damage. You got all these things that you're trying to balance, and that balance point is definitely one of them. And one big key thing here that will alter where you find that balance point at when it comes to jian in the first place, its length and its weight, so that you can have enough mass for the cut, but then still have enough point control. So don't get too hung up on the inches so much. Like, oh, you said 4, but this one says 6 and 8, so it must suck. It ain't that cut and dry. It's not that black and white. There are other factors to consider as to where that sweet spot is. If you do want a hard and fast rule, something simpler to go with, may I suggest the following guideline? And again, this is a guideline, not a commandment, not a hard and fast rule. As long as the balance point doesn't go past 1/3 of the blade, you generally are good. That's what I've noticed. If you have that balance point, at least on a jian, if you have it right in the middle of the blade or further down, then yeah, there's something wrong. If you got it all the way back here, then yeah, you'll probably have excellent point control, but it's not exactly going to have a very good cut. But if you have it close to that 1/3 mark, and again, look at the length of this sword. I'm going to pull it back a little bit. And notice I said the sweet spot's like right about here, where my finger is. See that? See that? That's about the 1/3 mark, isn't it? Got 1/3 here, 1/3 there, 1/3. If it's just under the 1/3 mark. If you have that balance point at that point, but it's not at the base, you're usually good to go. That's what I've noticed with every well-balanced jian that I've ever held. So I hope that helps if you're a little bit confused as to, oh, this seems so far forward, so far back. Consider the weight of the sword and consider the length. You have to, balance those factors if you're trying to have a good balance point for a good cut and a good thrust. Point control and all that. So I hope that's answered a few questions. I, hope it's also made you get a new perspective on, why these swords are balanced the way they are. Oh, and also I forgot to point out, by the way, when it comes to measuring parts of the blade, whether you want to measure the length of the blade, whether you're trying to find the balance point, a lot of swords based on Ming and Qing designs, remember that the blades are recessed into the handle. They're recessed into the handguard. It's not like that Flying Phoenix that I have over there or the other swords where the blade comes right out the handguard. Like there's no shroud over it. Here, there's just a little bit of a shroud. You can see I could put my finger right in there. And because of that, you're not going to be measuring from here. You're going to be measuring from where the blade actually comes out. So that's here. That's usually around that spot, like a little bit, almost to the middle of the handguard, almost. So, yeah, keep that in mind when you're measuring that. You're not supposed to measure from where it's emitting. You're supposed to measure it like right where it comes out. So if your jian happens to be, if you're trying to measure it at, the length of it or find a balance point, keep in mind where the blade's coming out from. You're measuring from where it actually comes out from the handguard. You're not measuring from the shroud, the part that's covering it, like that shroud spot. I hope that's making sense. Okay, so anyway, that's it. I should have something a little bit more entertaining next time. At least I hope so. I'm trying to knock out at least 2 more videos before the end of this month. We will see if that happens. But until then, catch you guys later.